Before we get started, please don't forget to rate and review wherever possible. It really helps our podcast find the ears of listeners just like you. Also, if you have a story to tell, don't forget to submit it via email at contact@campfirecultpod.com or leave a voicemail message at 720-297-8608. You can also follow us anywhere socially at campfirecultpod and visit us online at campfirecultpod.com. Welcome, dear listener, to the Campfire Cult Podcast. From a camper van deep in the haunted woods, I bring you first-hand accounts of chilling encounters with the paranormal. Step into the night and take a peek into the realm where reality and the supernatural collide. My name is Jazz, and I'll be your host. Welcome back, campers. On tonight's episode, we're visited by dark watchers, forest stalkers, shadow people, and much, much more. Putting this episode together was a real treat for me. I really hope you enjoyed as much as I do. Up first, we're headed to the Santa Lucia Mountains in Big Sur, California, where the dark watchers lurk.
The Santa Lucia mountain range, stretching from Monterey down the California coast, harbors a mysterious secret that has captivated imaginations for centuries. The enigmatic beings known as the Dark Watchers. These elusive entities, shrouded in mystery and tales of sightings, have become an integral part of the mountain's mystique. If you find yourself hiking through the wilderness of Big Sur and experience the eerie sensation of being observed, chances are you may have encountered these spectral figures. The origins of the Dark Watchers legend trace back to the early 18th century when Spanish settlers navigated the perilous San Lucia Mountains. The final obstacle before reaching the Pacific Ocean, these mountains were not only treacherous but also allegedly guarded by shadowy figures. The settlers, as they traversed the mountainous terrain, reported glimpses of dark, humanoid figures observing them from a distance. Known as Los Vigilantes Oscuros, the Dark Watchers left an indelible mark on the region's history. Even as American settlers replaced the Spanish in the region, reports of encounters with the Dark Watchers persisted. Regardless of one's background, be it Native American, Spanish settler, or a modern-day hiker, there exists a shared sense of unease among those who traverse the area. The sightings typically occur in the late afternoon, just before dusk, when the hills are cast in a hazy light. Witnesses describe the figures as towering entities roughly 10 feet tall, with long, thin limbs and sometimes adorned in wide-brimmed hats and cloaks. However, attempts to scrutinize these figures result in their sudden disappearance. The Dark Watchers, according to those who claim to have seen them, appear unsettling but not inherently dangerous. Preferring to linger in the shadows of the forest, they reportedly emerge only when individuals draw near. Legend has it that these entities are devoted to following travelers through the mountains, possessing heightened senses to detect the use of technology such as phones or GPS devices. If such technology is present, the Dark Watchers remain elusive. Among the notable witnesses to the Dark Watchers was the renowned author John Steinbeck. In his story Flight, a character encounters a dark figure atop a hill, identified as one of the enigmatic Watchers. Steinbeck's family held a peculiar connection to these beings, with his son Thomas even writing a book about them. Steinbeck's mother claimed to have interacted with the Dark Watchers during her journeys through the mountainous woods, leaving them gifts of flowers and food, and receiving similar offerings in return. The Steinbeck family's connection with the Dark Watchers adds an intriguing layer to the mysterious lore surrounding these entities. Recent sightings of the Dark Watchers share strikingly similar descriptions, contributing to the mystique surrounding them. One account from a hiker details the unsettling experience of encountering a hooded figure at the mountain summit. The figure, approximately 10 feet tall, emitted an otherworldly aura, prompting the witness to retreat and never return to that part of the mountain range. Another account, this time near the San Luis Obispo Reservoir, describes a massive hooded figure resembling the Grim Reaper, reinforcing the belief that the Dark Watchers are more than mere figments of imagination. The question that lingers is, what are the Dark Watchers? Various theories attempt to explain these mysterious entities, with one suggesting pareidolia as a potential explanation. Pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive specific images in random visual patterns. In the case of the Dark Watchers, this could mean that people interpret long shadows caused by trees as tall, humanoid figures. The suggestion is that, due to pareidolia, these figures are only visible at dawn or dusk when shadows are at their longest. However, this theory falls short when considering photographic evidence of the Dark Watchers. Another phenomenon, the Brock Inspector, offers a potential explanation. Named after the Broken Peak in the Harz Mountains of Germany, it involves the shadow of a hiker or climber cast on mountain mist below, creating shadowy figures surrounded by a rainbow halo. This effect, known as a glory, results from sunlight refracting off water droplets in the mist. While similar, the Brock Inspector doesn't fully align with the Dark Watchers' accounts, as the latter disappear swiftly rather than linger in the same manner. Skeptics propose alternative explanations, such as hypoxia and infrasound exposure. Hypoxia, caused by decreased oxygen levels at higher elevations, could induce hallucinations in hikers. Infrasound, generated when wind rushes down a mountain, can create low-frequency sounds that trigger anxiety and fear. However, these theories struggle to account for sightings from moving vehicles, adding a layer of complexity to the puzzle. While scientific explanations exist, they fall short of providing a comprehensive understanding of the Dark Watchers phenomenon. The mystery of the Dark Watchers persists, defying easy explanations. Whether they are manifestations of pareidolia, shadows cast on misty mountains, or something beyond our current understanding, the legends endure. The eerie allure of the Santa Lucia Mountains and the tales of the Dark Watchers continue to captivate those who dare to explore the region. As the stories and sightings persist, the enigmatic guardians of the Santa Lucia Mountains remain an enigma, shrouded in the mists of time and the shadows of the forest.
Coming up, on a road trip from Las Vegas to Mammoth Lakes, California, a duo encounters shadowy silhouettes along a lonely desert highway.
So other than with my friends and family, this is the first time I'm sharing this story. Full disclosure, before this experience, I've always been very skeptical of paranormal experiences and there's always another explanation for those things type of person. Anyways, this takes place summertime 4 years ago, if my memory serves me correctly, on a trip starting in the Las Vegas area of southern Nevada and ending in Mammoth Lakes, California. My husband, then boyfriend, and I were taking a road trip so I could show him one of my favorite camping and hiking places in California, and I was so excited to do so. It's a moderately long drive, but I'd done it before and wasn't too worried. It was later in the day when we left, after we had both gotten off work for the weekend. The beginning half of the drive was normal, just like any other drive. But once we reached the town of Beatty, it got really weird, really fast. After reaching Beatty, we both started feeling really uncomfortable, and for a brief moment couldn't figure out why. Shortly after, we started seeing figures that looked like dark, stretched-out silhouettes of people in the path of our headlights. They would appear to run into our line of sight in the road and then disappear very shortly before making contact with them with the car. They would not appear behind us on the ground, so we knew there was no contact made. It was a constant barrage of them, and I didn't know what to think of this. At first, I thought it was someone playing a prank on us, but it continued on for an hour. We didn't stop because by that time it was dark out, and I was too scared it would end up being a dangerous situation, i.e. serial killer, carjacking, etc. We also smelled the very distinct smell of fire burning. Due to the silhouettes we'd been seeing, we were far too afraid to stop and see what it could be, so we kept driving to our destination. The smell persisted for the entirety of the drive there from Beatty. It never waned. When we finally got to Mammoth, we debated back and forth on whether we should get out and check under the hood to make sure the smell wasn't something from the engine or something. It was pitch black outside. At this point, we were so terrified we actually considered just driving back home entirely. The smell of burning was incredibly strong and had no discernible source inside the car. Eventually, I got out and went to check outside the car and found no trace of the smell outside at all. We determined that the smell had to be coming from something inside the car and started investigating more. After a while, we located the source as a blanket that was between two other blankets in a stack that we had brought. The top and bottom blankets were ice cold and had no odor. The middle blanket smelled so strongly of smoke it burned my nose to sniff it, and it was very hot to the touch. We had no explanation for this. Scared but not sure what else to do, we dropped the weird blanket outside of the car, locked the doors, and went to sleep. After doing so, we didn't experience anything else. We aren't sure if this is just a coincidence or not. We stayed and enjoyed the rest of our trip. After a day, we pretty much forgot about the experience until it was time to head back home. On our way back home, this time during the daylight, we passed a house in Beatty that looked like it had been burned down, covered in graffiti of various symbols and images that looked to be sigils. I wish I had the thought to grab a picture at the time, but I was driving and just wanted to get home. We have always wondered if something at that house is what caused our experience. My best friend owns property there, and when I went back to the town with her, we could not find the house. She mentioned there had recently been some kind of project to clean up the town and remove abandoned buildings, and I wonder if it had been removed already. To this day, we aren't sure what we experienced. A friend of my husband's suggested it could have been several things, shadow people being one of them. After looking into it a bit, I think they could be right, but I don't know enough about these types of things to be certain.
Next, a seasoned outdoorsman has an unexplainable experience in the Cascade Mountain Range of Washington State.
I've been an avid camper most of my life. More than that, I actually lived in the Wyoming wilderness for almost 2 years as a child in a house on a nature preserve. A place where electricity was only available by generator and we had to boil water that me and my siblings carried up from the creek. If there were emergencies, it would be at least an hour before we could get to help or help could get to us. I've hunted dangerous game, not particularly proud of it, but it happened. And seen some weird shit in the desert. So when I say that I will not venture into the woods of the Cascadia mountain range alone, it's important to know that the wilderness doesn't frighten me easily. I was 23 years old when a friend of mine, we'll call him Darren, all names are altered, invited me to a camping trip. The site was a place a few miles up a logging road, so about an hour-long hike from an already out-in-the-middle-of-nowhere back road. It was just me, Darren, and his good friend Wade. The place was, from the logging road, about 10 minutes down a trail. The moment we got to the site, I was excited. The small lake was beautiful, barely touched by people over the years. It also comforted me somewhat when we got there to see that within the last month at least, somebody else had camped out there because we found extra wood by the fire pit. We ate a bunch of chili and hot dogs, but around dusk, the guys went off into the woods and came back with a sealed bucket they had buried the year before that was full of MREs. It was looking to be one of the better camping trips I'd have had in my adult life. That night was a bit different. For the first time in my life, I felt an uneasiness sleeping in my tent. I couldn't quite place it, chalked it up to not being used to camping without my dad. Darren brought his .38 special for protection from predators, but he was the only one armed. The next day it rained, as it does in the Pacific Northwest, and we tried to wait it out but eventually called it quits, packed up, and went home. Fast forward to the next year. Me and Darren get the itch to go camping again, and I wanted to give that site another shot. I spent a great deal of effort convincing a bunch of my friends to tag along. In the end, it wound up being 6 of us and a big white German shepherd, me, Darren, Wade, James, Charles, and Rita, James's girlfriend, and Boogie the dog. Knowing about the uneasiness felt the last time, I brought my 12 gauge. James wanted to get some unregulated target practice in, shooting shit they don't allow at official gun ranges like full cans and gallon jugs of water. We also brought a quad with us this time so we could haul a bunch of extra water, booze, and other supplies to make our weekend more comfortable. First day, as we're setting up, we hear a loudspeaker playing some music over by the south end of the lake, which was basically right next to the logging road, and this could be seen from the road unlike the year prior. Deciding we're tough guy Americans, me and James saunter down to meet the source of the noise pollution. Now, I have to commend the coolness of the cop that was just having a fishing trip when two large armed men emerged from the tree line. We introduced ourselves, mentioned the others, but not exactly where we were camping, just that it was nearby. That's when shit started to get creepy. It could have just been cops doing cop shit, but this guy really wanted to know exactly where we were gonna be. Then he mentioned his favorite spots nearby and really wanted us to try this other spot 2 more miles down the logging road. At a point, it was almost like he was suggesting that was the only spot where we wouldn't be in trouble. Darren showed up finally, told us that he spoke to the landowners several years ago and they were fine with us being there. The cop was visibly upset, but we lied and said we'd check out the site he was pushing. None of us trusted the guy when we left, so we decided not to go further down the logging road like he suggested. It was like a horror movie set up. The whole shady cop tells us to go to the spot where his hillbilly friends are gonna kidnap us kind of vibe. We move on. It was still pretty early in the day, so we set up our stuff and got a fire going and floated around on our giant 4-person inflatable chair boat thing. Biggest highlight of the day, Charles cut down an entire dead tree with nothing but a small axe. It turned out to be a good day leading into a good night. But right after it got dark, I felt uneasy again. The first thing that worried me was a couple of us heard something big splash into the far side of the lake. We thought maybe it was Boogie, but he was by the fire, his head now perked up and looking in the direction of the splash. Since we were drunk, we thought maybe the floaty thing might be compromised, so we went down with flashlights to pull it out of the water and onto the bank. Then we heard the owl. Charles, Wade, and Darren were already passed out by midnight. Rita was humming along by the fireplace with Boogie, and me and James were out getting some more wood so the fire would last. We heard the owl hooting again, a cadence I was familiar with in the area, but something was off about it. I have a gift for mimicking bird noises, so what I noticed immediately is the ending hoot was off. Sounds like the owl is rolling its R's during the final hoot of the sequence. James, not nearly as outdoorsy as me, says, "That almost sounds like a person." We joke, listen to it a couple more times, then I do my own attempt at an owl noise. Then, silence. Just as I am thinking that makes sense because of the noise, it starts up again, but not just one owl. Another started up about half a second after the first. The new owl sounding more like an actual owl than the first one that seemed to have started up again. And after the first hoot from the real owl, the fake one stopped short. "Did that owl just tell the other owl to shut up?" James says to me. I decide to shout, "Better listen to your wife, dude." Immediately after I shout, we both hear a loud crashing, almost identical to the sound of the tree falling that Charles did earlier that day. Boogie starts to go fucking berserk, barking and growling. He was threatened, and luckily Rita was there to keep him from bolting. Big as he was, if he really wanted to move, she wouldn't be much of an obstacle. I'm about to shit my pants out of fear. I will reiterate for effect. I have hunted mountain lions and bears in my life, and at no point during those hunts was I as shaken and genuinely afraid as this. I was paralyzed for like an entire minute. "Whoever that is, you better fuck off. We have plenty of guns," I shout across the lake. Then silence again, luckily for the rest of the night. I didn't fall asleep until Darren woke up, basically at sunrise. I missed breakfast and a morning swim in the lake the others all enjoyed. Darren, Wade, and Rita just wanted to listen to the radio and chill. Boogie had run off just after lunch, and we decided to go look for him while also investigating the area of the noises last night. Almost immediately, when we get to the other side of the lake, the hair stands up on the back of my neck. Charles also feels creeped out, but he had an axe, I had a shotgun, and James had his rifle and his .45 holstered on his hip. So we pressed onward, looking for probably a couple of hours. I was mainly trying to see if we could spot any trees that had fallen. Then, we made it to the eastern bank of the lake. We were camped on the western side. "Holy shit!" Charles says, causing me and James to come rushing over. There, we saw what looked like a human footprint. Just one, but it was very clearly a footprint in the mud, even had a little pool of water still in it. My first thought was Bigfoot, so I took off my boot and compared sizes. I am a huge guy with pretty large feet, so it wasn't a surprise that my clodhoppers dwarfed this footprint when I put my own print down next to it. But what was weird was the other print, where the pinky toe would be, looked like another big toe was there instead. We also found several downed trees, but none that looked recent. So we decided to go around the north end of the lake and back to the others, eventually doing a full loop around the lake. Boogie was fine. As soon as food smells filled the air, he came running back. And we all had a pretty good day again. Drinking, feasting, and making fun of each other for being paranoid. We heard some gunshots a little close, and then called out to warn the shooters that there were people and animals nearby. Part of me consciously thought, anything that was lurking around sure isn't now. Boy, was I wrong. A brief mention about Charles. Ever since we were kids, Charles has had vivid night terrors. Most of the time funny, some of the time scary. He'd full-on sleepwalk and have conversations with you while still asleep. We had all gone to bed. I was one of the first, due to getting like 4 hours of sleep and being quite rum-drunk. "Hey, who's that?" Charles, who was sleeping on a tarp by the fire instead of in a tent, started shouting. I shot up, grabbed the shotgun, and turned on my flashlight. "What's wrong?" I shout, adrenaline filling my entire existence. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Don't crouch down and come closer to the fire," he shouts, finally stirring awake James and Rita, who were in the tent closest to Charles. "What the fuck?" James calls out, and Boogie starts growling. "There's somebody sneaking up on Captain's tent. Get out here." I start to unzip my tent. "Not you, Captain. Stay in there. He's right next to you." Everybody else to this day denies hearing this, but I swear I heard something whisper, "Captain," before hearing a twig crunch right outside my tent. James makes it out of his tent, and seconds later I hear him laughing. It's just the tree stump with the water jug on top. Charles is just having a night terror. Charles claimed he wasn't dreaming, but when I got out and shined the light on the stump, he agreed that that had to be it. Satisfied that there wasn't actually anything there, despite my protests, we all went back to bed. Charles stayed in the tent for the rest of the night, but I decided to spend the rest of the night on watch. That was one of, if not the most, terrifying nights of my life. I heard more activity that night in those woods than I had ever heard before. Boogie would wake up and chuff multiple times as I'd hear twigs snapping off in the trees. Then I heard a really big snap that had to have only been about 10 feet away. I jumped to my feet, turned to where the noise was, and shined my light. I've seen enough deer booty in my life to know what I saw running away. What is not normal of deer, however, is they don't stand up and run on their back legs. Boogie howled and snarled. I took aim, letting my light drop, and fired. I didn't care that it turned to run. I fucking unloaded. Boom after boom after boom until I ran out of all 6 shells I had loaded. Everyone else was freaking the fuck out and rushed out of their tents. I told them what happened, and nobody went back to bed until the morning. Nothing else happened that night. I think Boogie refusing to leave the tent was what allowed the others to take me seriously enough. He was a brave dog, sweet, but if mean dogs fucked with him at the park, he knew how to throw down. The last thing that happened, on that last day, Darren and Wade went to go bury the bucket after putting some fresh new supplies in it. They had always known where the cache was buried because there was a weird-looking stump that they used as a landmark. That stump was just gone. It was there when we retrieved the cache 2 days prior, but now it was vanished. No signs of it being uprooted, dragged, or disturbed. It simply was as though it never existed. We all thought we made a mistake until we found the hole for the bucket, still dug and with the little poncho stuffed in it. "Well, I'm never coming back here now, so we may as well take this with us," Darren said, and we all left after lunch. That is now why I will never go hiking again in the Cascade Wilderness without a firearm and at least 2 other people who know how to use them.
Next up, reluctant campers in the American Southeast encounter pale, illuminated faces watching them from the shadows.
I'd never been a big fan of camping. Circa 2012, for some reason or another, my friend and I decided to take a Saturday night to camp on private property we had permission from the owner on the bank of a small lake in the rural American Southeast. The lake wasn't very large, probably only 50 to 150 yards across. I'm not great at estimating distance. It was more of a deep pond, but it was 5 times as long as it was wide, and from the perspective of our camp, it consumed the majority of our sightline. The plot of land itself wasn't entirely removed from civilization. We were 5 to 10 miles outside of a small suburb of a mid-sized southern city. It definitely was not easy to access, however, and the only way in was a gated, narrow dirt road across a levee which spanned one side of the lake. This road was gated and locked. The owner gave us his code. We pulled the car through and locked the gate behind us. If you've ever been down south, you know how quickly it gets isolated outside of cities. Our cities are small, and the rural people around often live rough and wild. We have dense woods, so thick that they're not worth building in unless you have some connection or attachment to the area. I've heard it was not profitable to cut roads through a lot of it when they were building highways in the 50s, so not much development has happened in the last 100 years, and in some places since the Civil War. It's not uncommon to go for a 30-minute drive straight out of town and come upon cabins that are obviously off the grid. My friend and I were used to living in the suburbs, so we were just happy to see stars and hear the sounds of nature. We were at our very utilitarian camp, small Coleman 2-person tent and a blanket, simply looking around and enjoying the night when suddenly my buddy sat up real straight. He said something like, "Do you see that guy over there?" He pointed to the other side of the small lake. I didn't see anything. I sat up slightly and said, "Nah, it's just the dark playing tricks on you." He seemed actually shaken. "No, look, there's a bunch of faces behind the trees now," he said. That got my attention, and I sat up fully, rubbing my eyes to try to gain full focus. And then I saw them. Small, round, white faces stared back at me from across the lake. Maybe 15 to 20 of them. All were positioned in such a way that their bodies were behind the trees, and only their heads were visible. The best way I can describe the faces is like very pale, somehow internally illuminated children. I should mention that neither of us were drinking or high. We were too young for that, not for at least a few more years. We had eaten dinner at home and were just planning on going to sleep after chilling out for a while. The faces weren't moving. I was kind of sitting there in shock, thinking that my eyes would adjust and I would see that they were a reflection, bugs or owls, or something. But I would never come to that realization. I stared right back at them for what felt like 5 minutes, looked back at my friend, and then they were gone. Bodies of water carry sound extremely well, and we heard extensive shuffling from the other side of the lake and a couple of small branches snap. It's incredible what your ears pick up on during an otherwise silent night. My buddy was tearing up a little when he said, "What the hell were those?" And I didn't have a good answer. Neither of us slept particularly well. I definitely felt validated in my feelings of disliking camping. But what were we going to do? I tried to do some research on the internet, but never found a phenomenon that could explain what we both saw.
Coming up next, in the summer of 2005, amongst the serene beauty of Upper Swagger Lake in Idaho's Lost River mountain range, 2 friends have an otherworldly experience with a bright golden light.
It was the summer of 2005. A friend of mine, Wayne, and I decided to spend the day fishing at Upper Swagger Lake in the Lost River mountain range of Idaho. visited mostly by the locals. This alpine lake is tucked up on a ridge overseeing two long, dry canyons on opposite sides. It sits just at the top of the tree line, providing an uninhibited view of the sky and surrounding mountain peaks. The fishing is usually pretty good if you like golden trout. I personally hate trout and think they taste like mud, but I do love the challenge of fishing for them. And some of the best, most secluded lake fishing can be found on these high Idaho lakes. Getting to Swagger Lake is not an easy task. It's a 100-mile journey over a lonely highway from the region's largest town, Idaho Falls. When you hit the dirt road turnoff, there are miles of four-wheel driving up the canyon to the hiking trail. Once at the trailhead, it's a 2-mile, 1,000-foot vertical gain hike up to the lake. But when you finally arrive, surrounded by the bald peaks of the Little Lost Range, it's all worth the effort. Arriving at the lake around noon, we spent the day fishing, relaxing, and chatting. Far down in the canyon, out of sight from us, we continually heard periodic loud blasts. Growing up in the rural U.S., you get accustomed to people target shooting on public land. And that's what we concluded was happening below us. From the sheer thunderousness, we guessed it was a large caliber muzzle-loading rifle. The blasts were spaced out long enough that they had to be manually reloading their guns. The shots reverberated and echoed throughout the canyon. Whoever was down there was having a bit of fun with their rifle. Unperturbed by the cacophony down in the canyon, we continued fishing, only momentarily reminded of the explosions as they continued to occur throughout the day. The fishing was great and the day seemed to flash by. Before we knew it, the sun was cresting on the mountains. We headed back to camp for the night. Wayne had caught his limit towards the end of the day while I had been releasing mine. We settled down to a campfire and watched the sun sink behind the mountain peaks as Wayne cooked his muddy fish. It was twilight now. Aside from the crackling of the fire, it was a quiet evening. The sky was absolutely clear, and we watched as the star twinkled into existence in the sky. Our relaxation was interrupted by yet another one of those thunderous explosions, only this time much closer to us. That was weird. Target shooting is extremely dangerous at night. Whoever was down there in the canyon was being very irresponsible. Wayne nudged me with his elbow and motioned for me to look in the direction of the sound of the last explosion. While not directly visible to us, there was a light down the mountain. It was illuminating the whole canyon. From the angles of the tree shadows, we could see the source of the light was not at ground level. It was up high in the air and it was moving. We watched in bewildered silence as the light moved up the canyon. We still could not get a direct line of sight on it. There was another blast that seemed to shake my skull. The light in the canyon flashed almost 100 times brighter than before. We could absolutely not make sense of what was happening. As we sat there unsure of what to do, the light rose upwards out of the canyon. As it crested the trees and continued to rise, so we could finally get a direct look, it was a brilliant ball of yellow-golden light. Getting a size estimate was difficult, but I figured it was between 20 to 40 feet in diameter. The light rose silently above the canyon and then above our elevation at the lake. It stopped several hundred feet above the surrounding landscape and stayed there. The object's surface shimmered and danced. Little feathers of sparks would periodically jump away from the object and fall down towards the trees below. Wayne looked at me, and all I could do was shrug my shoulders and give him a "I have no damn idea" look. After a few minutes, the ball's surface stopped dancing. It was completely still in the air above us, no sound, no movement. With no warning, it exploded in a deafening shower of sparks and blinding light. Wayne and I instinctively jumped into the dirt and covered our heads. The light was so bright I felt I could see through my closed eyelids. The explosion shook everything around us. I could feel the shock resonate in the ground beneath me. It was like the world was coming undone at the seams. Then everything was absolutely silent and dark. The whole event could only have been a handful of seconds long, but it felt like hours. When we looked up into the sky, the ball of light was gone. We were left alone in just the dim light of the stars. Picking myself up out of the dirt, all I could say to Wayne was, "What in the hell was that all about?" He chuckled nervously but didn't reply. We surveyed the camp and the surrounding area. Nothing seemed damaged or disturbed. There were no signs of fires that were started from the explosion. It was like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The one thing that was off, though, was the time. It was late twilight when the light exploded above us, but my watch was showing 2 o'clock in the morning. Further baffling us was Wayne's fish. They were now charred cinders above a bed of red coals that was once our campfire. I'm well aware of the phenomenon of missing time, but that was not possible. The stupid thing exploded and we hit the dirt, and then we picked ourselves up a couple minutes after. I didn't have the mental capacity to process what had happened. I headed to my tent and went right to sleep. It was a deep, dreamless sleep. When I awoke, the morning sun was illuminating the tent and Wayne was already up and fishing. I asked him about his thoughts on what happened last night and he simply shrugged and said, "It either didn't happen, or we saw something we probably shouldn't have. It's that or Marvin the Martian tried to kill us." We fished for a few hours that morning, then decided against camping another night at the lake. We packed up camp and hiked down to our vehicle. This happened almost 20 years ago, and I've been back to Swagger Lake several times over the years. I've never seen or heard anything like what we saw on that night. Again, I don't have an explanation for what happened and don't believe we ever will. If anyone is interested, Swagger Lake's coordinates are 44 degrees, 4 minutes, 55 seconds north and 113 degrees, 34 minutes, 46 seconds west. Happy exploring.
Next, haunted by a childhood encounter, a man recounts witnessing the transformation of a deer into a man, leaving him convinced he narrowly escaped a horrifying encounter with a skinwalker.
When I was younger, I'd get lost in these woods a lot and sometimes even sleep in them for a couple of days at most, surviving off fish and creek water. I never had any creepy encounters besides this one time. I was about 10 years old, and just like I do at least once every 2 to 3 years, I had gotten lost in the woods again. I was completely fine during the day, as I had eaten an hour prior to realizing I had no idea where I was, so I had the old, "ah shit, here we go again" moment, and decided to walk around to find some sticks to make a little fire. I knew a lot about outdoor survival as my family went camping a lot, and I watched videos on YouTube all the time since it interested me and I loved the woods. I had set a fire up as it started getting dark and was about to put out my fire before I saw a small deer on the tree line just nearly out of range of my fire's light. It was staring at me, which gave me some chills, but I just waved to it. Then the deer scurried off into a bush behind it, and it was gone. Then I heard this really weird noise like twigs snapping, and all of a sudden, a much larger deer came out of the same bush I just saw the small one jump into. At this point, I knew something was off, so I stood up and stared at the deer as it stared back at me. I was mentally preparing myself for the idea that this thing could run at me. The deer started walking a bit towards me, and I backed up a little and crouched down. As the deer kept getting closer and I kept backing up, I looked down and realized this creature had a hoof directly in the fire and wasn't reacting to it at all. This creeped me out. I mean, its fur was burning and it was starting to burn its skin, but it just wasn't reacting. I immediately set off bolting, but I heard it coming behind me, not really running, but fast enough to keep up with my little legs. I came over this small hill and jumped down into a bush to try and hide from it, and that's when it happened. The scariest thing I've ever seen in my entire life, and I remember it so vividly. The deer's silhouette against the moonlight appeared, and as I stared at the deer, it let out this blood-curdling call that I've never heard from another animal before. All of a sudden, the silhouette started caving in on itself. I could hear its bones snapping and flesh ripping, and this thing just kept getting smaller. Suddenly, it got much bigger, and I closed my eyes because I just couldn't watch anymore. When I opened them, there was a man standing where the deer stood, or at least the silhouette of a man. He was looking around and then started calling out in this creepy, almost distorted voice, "Hello? Hello?" And he repeated this for about 10 minutes, while I just sat there in silence, refusing to answer whatever stood just a couple of meters above me. The man then walked off into the trees, and I heard that same awful snapping noise before it eventually faded away. I didn't sleep that night, I stayed in that bush the rest of the night, terrified that this thing could still be lurking around the area, waiting for me to appear again. Once the morning came, I walked in a straight line until I reached a road I recognized, and then I ran home. I didn't tell my family about it as I feared I wouldn't be taken seriously, but I was terrified. I haven't been into the woods since that day and always stayed home when my family went camping after begging them not to go. I'm 21 now. That incident was 10 to 11 years ago, and I still remember that silhouette and the noise of the bones snapping. I've done tons of research, and my only conclusion to what happened is that I narrowly escaped a skinwalker or a knot deer. I'm shaking from fear as I write all of this, remembering that horrific night.
In this next story, we're experiencing a glitch in the Matrix.
When I went to college, I befriended a professor of mathematics. He was one of the most intelligent, eloquent, and articulate people that I've ever known. A remarkable family man who married in his 20s with a daughter and a son. He never drank or smoked, never used drugs, never permitted himself to curse, raise his voice, or become aggressive even in disagreements. He was always in control, always punctual and on time, always organized and very disciplined. And he wore clothing that would not look out of place at the turn of the 20th century and acted like a true gentleman. I'm just telling you what kind of man he was. Not a crazy man, not a junkie, no mental illnesses. I had the pleasure of taking advanced algebra, Calculus 1, Calculus 2, and differential equations with him. Anyway, we had this STEM club room in the math department where we students hang out to study and chit-chat. And sometimes our professor would join us for help with tutoring, homework, exam study help, and just discussions about various unrelated topics. One time he told us a story about when he saw something strange in the woods. This happened during the 90s when he was a teenager. He lived in Quincy, California during that time. And he had a hobby of driving his dad's old beat-up truck all over the Sierra Nevada mountains, just for exploring and also for hunting animals and gathering wild berries. He liked following old mining roads and seeing where they led. One such time, he was out looking for blackberries to pick. It was getting late and the sun had set. So he was driving down this narrow road when he saw there was an obstruction in the road. He said he saw what looked like a stretched giant plastic bag going clear across the road. He thought it might have been construction work or something. As he drove up to it, he stopped his vehicle within 40 feet of it. And he saw that it was not a plastic bag at all. It was some kind of screen or curtain, a two-dimensional flat shape stretching over the road, perpendicular to it. It was a rectangular shape with the width of the road, and about 1.5 times in height. And he saw that it was translucent, like some kind of hologram. It was like semi-transparent, because when my professor shone a flashlight through the rectangle, the light penetrated through it, illuminating the road past it, but just barely, like the light only went a foot or two beyond that screen. It was just standing or floating there, and yet it was not attached to anything. It held its own weight, but it was like weightless at the same time. Its surface was wavy or rippling. My professor got out of the car to investigate this strange floating rectangle. He went right up to it, and as he did, it was like it was emitting a vibration or low humming that he could feel in his bones. There was an effect that the closer you got to the rectangle, the stronger the vibration was. And as he got close to it, he saw the hair on his arm standing up, like there was some kind of energy in the air. Because there were dense trees on either side of the road, he couldn't go around it. He went up to the trees and broke off a branch. He then poked the branch into this rectangle, and he saw subtle ripples going up and down through the rectangle from the place where he touched the surface. And he stuck the stick all the way into the rectangle, and there was no resistance, but he didn't see the stick going through the other side of it. It was like it disappeared or became invisible. And then he pulled it out, and the stick was unchanged, not burned or deformed. Not knowing what this rectangle was, he went back to his car, continually looking at it. He didn't want to risk driving through it, though. So he drove his car in reverse until the road became wide enough to turn around and head back where he came from. To this day, he doesn't know what it was. I don't know if he ever went back there again. I've asked, but he won't share the location with me.
Next, we delve into a chilling story that unfolds on the quiet streets of Westfield, New Jersey. This is a tale of a family's dream home turned into a nightmare by an elusive stalker known only as the Watcher.
In June of 2014, Derek and Maria Broaddus embarked on a journey to transform their lives by purchasing their dream home at 657 Boulevard. Little did they know that this idyllic haven would soon become a nightmare, haunted by a mysterious figure known only as the Watcher. The tale unfolds with the arrival of a handwritten letter, setting off a series of events that would plunge the Broaddus family into a relentless spiral of fear and paranoia. The first letter, a bizarre welcome to the neighborhood, revealed a disturbing family tradition, generations of watchers overseeing the house. The ominous declaration, "It is now my time," marked the beginning of the Watcher's sinister correspondence. The letter's unsettling inquiries about the Broaddus family's motives and the history of 657 Boulevard left the family unnerved, prompting Derek to contact the police. The first letter read, "Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. How did you end up here? Did 657 Boulevard call to you with its force within? I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out. I see already that you have flooded 657 Boulevard with contractors so that you can destroy the house as it was supposed to be. Bad move. You don't want to make 657 Boulevard unhappy. You have children. I have seen them. So far, I think there are 3 that I have counted. Are there more on the way? I asked the woods to bring me young blood, and it looks like they listened. Better for me. Was your old house too small for the growing family, or was it greed to bring me your children? Once I know their names, I will call to them and draw them to me. Who am I? There are hundreds and hundreds of cars that drive by 657 Boulevard each day. Maybe I am in one. Look at all the windows you can see from 657 Boulevard. Maybe I am in one of those too. Look out any of the many windows in 657 Boulevard at all the people who stroll by each day. Maybe I'm one of them. Welcome, my friends, welcome. Let the party begin. The Watcher. The authorities initially dismissed the letter as a possible prank, but matters took a darker turn when a second letter arrived, specifically targeting the Broaddus children. The Watcher claimed knowledge of their names and expressed a perverse interest in their activities, escalating the situation from an unsettling mystery to a full-blown terror campaign against the family. The second letter, received on June 18, 2014, read, "Welcome again to your new home at 657 Boulevard. The workers have been busy, and I have been watching you unload carfuls of your personal belongings. The dumpster is a nice touch. Have they found what is in the walls yet? In time they will. I am pleased to know your names now, and the name of the young blood you have brought to me. You certainly say their names often. 657 Boulevard is anxious for you to move in. It has been years and years since the young blood ruled the hallways of the house. Have you found all of the secrets it holds yet? Will the young blood play in the basement, or are they too afraid to go down there alone? I would be very afraid if I were them. It is far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. Will they sleep in the attic, or will you all sleep on the second floor? Who has the bedrooms facing the street? I'll know as soon as you move in. It will help me to know who is in which bedroom. Then I can plan better. All of the windows and doors in 657 Boulevard allow me to watch you and track you as you move through the house. Who am I? I am the Watcher and have been in control of 657 Boulevard for the better part of 2 decades now. The Woods family turned it over to you. It was their time to move on and kindly sold it when I asked them to. I pass by many times a day. 657 Boulevard is my job, my life, my obsession. And now you are too, Broaddus family. Welcome to the product of your greed. Greed is what brought the past 3 families to 657 Boulevard, and now it has brought you to me. Have a happy moving-in day. You know I will be watching." The subsequent letters grew more sinister, with the Watcher expressing anger and frustration at the changes the Broadduses made to the house. One letter read, "The house is crying from all of the pain it is going through. You have changed it and made it so fancy. You are stealing its history. It cries for the past and what used to be in the time when I roamed its halls. The 1960s were a good time for 657 Boulevard when I ran from room to room, imagining life with the rich occupants there. The house was full of life and young blood. Then it got old, and so did my father. But he kept watching until the day he died. And now, I watch and wait for the day when the young blood will be mine again. The eerie details about the house's history, coupled with threats and intimate knowledge of the family's activities, left Derek and Maria living in constant fear. The Watcher's relentless pursuit of the Broaddus family continued, with each letter pushing the boundaries of sanity. The letter continued, 657 Boulevard is turning on me. It is coming after me. I don't understand why. What spell did you cast on it? It used to be my friend, and now it is my enemy. I am in charge of 657 Boulevard. It is not in charge of me. I will fend off its bad things and wait for it to become good again. It will not punish me. I will rise again. I will be patient and wait for this to pass, and for you to bring the young blood back to me. Come back. Let the young blood play again like I once did. Let the young blood sleep in 657 Boulevard. Stop changing it and let it alone. Terrified for their children's safety, Maria stopped bringing them to the house, realizing that the Watchers seemed to have an uncanny knowledge of their every move. The Broadduses involved the police, hired a private investigator, and even suspected their next-door neighbors, the Langfords. However, the Watcher's identity remained elusive, tightening its grip on the Broaddus family with each passing day. The Broadduses' attempts to sell the house were thwarted, as potential buyers backed out upon learning about the Watcher's menacing letters. Derek, suffering from insomnia and depression, initiated his own investigation, suspecting the Langfords. Despite law enforcement clearing the neighbors, the family found themselves without leads and trapped in a relentless cycle of torment. Faced with no other option, the Broaddus family decided to rent out the house, warning the new tenants about the Watcher and allowing them to break the lease if they received any letters. However, the Watcher struck again, sending a chilling fourth letter, confirming that the nightmare was far from over. The family's desperation reached a breaking point as they sought refuge from the unrelenting torment. The fourth letter read, "Violent winds and bitter cold to the vile and spiteful Derek and his wench of a wife Maria. 657 Boulevard survived your attempted assault and stood strong with its army of supporters barricading its gates. My soldiers of the Boulevard followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission and saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. All hail the Watcher. Maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away, but makes you feel sick day after day after day after day after day. Maybe the mysterious death of a pet, loved ones suddenly die, planes and cars and bicycles crash, bones break, you are despised by the house, and the Watcher won." In a surprising twist, it was revealed that Derek, in a moment of desperation, had sent threatening letters to other residents in the neighborhood. His actions, driven by the lack of closure and resolution, added another layer to the mystery surrounding 657 Boulevard. The family's nightmare continued until July of 2019, when the house was finally sold, relieving them of the burden but leaving the Watcher's identity shrouded in darkness. Today, 657 Boulevard stands as a chilling symbol of the Broaddus family's harrowing experience and the unsolved mystery of the Watcher. The questions surrounding this enigmatic figure persist. What drove the Watcher to terrorize the Broaddus family? Was it a neighbor, a disgruntled acquaintance, or something more sinister? The answers remain elusive, and the haunting legacy of 657 Boulevard endures as a testament to the mysterious and malevolent forces that can infiltrate the sanctity of one's home.
In our final episode of the evening, a seasoned expedition canoe guide tasked with leading a group of Boy Scouts through the wilderness of the Boundary Waters in northern Minnesota finds himself entangled in a series of unexplained phenomena that lurks within the vast and remote landscapes of the northern Minnesota and Ontario, Canada wilderness.
In the summer of 2012, I took a job as an expedition canoe guide on the Boundary Waters in northern Minnesota. These are a massive wilderness area of lakes and land. I was working for the Boy Scouts, and we were based on Moose Lake on the US side. My job was to facilitate a fun and safe multi-day trip, anywhere from 7 to 12 days out. Most of that summer was typical, but one expedition in particular still haunts me as a result of what happened to us over the course of a few days. Here is the account in full. My crew was on the younger side. There were 9 of us total, the maximum allowed in a group per our permit. There were 6 scouts, 2 adult scoutmasters, and myself. They had wanted to do a 200-miler but didn't have the physical ability, so we had to amend our route. They were bummed out, so I decided to take them to a waterfall called Eddy Falls. We visited the falls and camped pretty close to it. That evening, I had the boys working on camp setup while the advisors worked on fire for dinner. I was collecting firewood in a big tangle of down trees, brush, and bramble. I could faintly hear the falls off to my left when out of nowhere I hear the most unearthly scream roar I've ever heard. It stopped me dead in my tracks, and I was frozen. The second scream was closer, and the third closer. I couldn't see anything due to the thickness of the brush, but whatever this was, it was coming directly at me. By the fourth scream, I could feel it in my chest. I got nauseous and involuntarily barked at it. I've never before or since heard that sound come out of my body. The fifth scream almost physically hurt, but it snapped me back to reality and I ran back to camp. My crew had heard it too, but what am I to tell them? I claimed it was a boar. There's no boar up there, and the advisors knew I was lying but didn't call my bluff. After dinner, they went to their tents and I retired to my hammock about 50 yards from camp. As a rule, I always set my hammock at my head height, so about 6 feet up. I would use a tarp over my body and head to keep the morning dew off and the morning mosquitoes at bay. But the tarp wasn't strung up, that's important. It was just loosely over me. It must have been around 3 to 4 a.m. when I was awakened by what sounded to me like a woman sobbing. Not an outright cry, but a sob. At the same time, I'm hearing something walking through the thick brush down past my feet. So I listen, totally still and quiet, as it crosses into camp. I could hear the change from brush to granite rock, but could still hear its heavy footfalls as it walked right through camp and on towards me. At this point, the tarp is still over my head, so I can't see a thing and I don't know what to do. In no time, it was standing right next to me. I could hear the breathing, loud and congested sounding. I could smell the musk. I could feel its enormous presence only inches from my body. Just standing there. Time to make a decision. I suddenly threw the tarp off my head, and as I did this, my left hand touched this thing in the chest. It was dark, but I could make out briefly a very large, upright figure. The hair on it was long and coarse. The musculature was impressive, a bodybuilder's pecs is what I touched. It all happened in a second, and as soon as my hand made contact, it bolted back into the brush with immense speed for such thick debris. By the time I got my headlamp on, it was gone. My crew had slept through it all, so I read until the sun came up and decided not to mention it. The next day, we moved on a few miles towards the base camp and camped on a small island. Campsites on the US side are designated by a fire pit and a grumper, which is a fiberglass toilet over a deep hole. We were just arriving, and it was evening. One of the adult advisors needed to visit the grumper, so he walked towards it. About 2 minutes later, we heard him yelling, and he came running back to camp, still pulling his pants up, and said that he'd just seen a gorilla run right in front of him. I asked if maybe it was a bear, and he said absolutely not, that he'd hunted bear for years, and it was not a bear. It was a monkey, and it was about 9 feet tall. At this height estimate, I'm imagining being back in my hammock. If I touched the chest and I was about 6 feet off the ground, that puts the head close to 9 feet up. Was it stalking us? Was there more than one? The boys are now scared. Time to mitigate. I suggest a night paddle. No one's sleeping anymore anyway, so we pack back up and set out at around 8 p.m. and paddled by headlamp for several miles. My plan was to get back onto Moose Lake and camp very near to the base so we could be the first crew off water the following day. Moose Lake is connected to Newfoundland Lake by a small pinch and a channel of water that's not very deep or wide. There's dark woods on both sides. We were right in the middle of the pinch when a rock the size of a basketball came flying out of the woods on the right side and narrowly missed the bow of the canoe I was steering. There's no cliff there. This thing was forcefully thrown at us from the tree line. At this, we paddled like hell. We paddled to the center of Moose Lake, tied all 3 canoes together, and we sat out there all night. With the sunrise, we paddled to the base camp and ended our expedition. They did not want to talk about what happened, and I was okay with that. They left for Oklahoma the next day. After they left, I went to work a shift in the canoe yard helping crews offload. My buddy Justin got back that day from a trip in the same area we had been in, Bear Loop, and as I was helping him put a boat on the rack, I noticed he had a distant look, almost 1,000-yard stare. I asked how his trip went, and he said it was all good until they hit Newfoundland Lake. He said they were being messed with for 2 nights, and then had rocks thrown at them in the Newfoundland Pinch. Sure enough, for a solid 2 weeks after that, crews kept coming back from that area with very similar stories. One night, there was a crowd of guides in the staff lodge swapping trail stories, and these encounters came up one after another. Screams, rocks, sightings of apes. Then, from the back corner of the room, I hear a chuckle. It's one of the old veteran guides who'd been there for over a decade. All he said was, "It's about time somebody else saw one." I asked how long he'd known they were there. He said he's been encountering them for 10 years. Then he said, "They talk to me." This shocked me. "Like a language?" I asked. "No, they communicate telepathically. The less you acknowledge them, the less they'll bother you, but they can read you and they like it when you're afraid. It's like a game to them." What happened out there is still a big question in my mind. I've always been open to the idea of Sasquatch. Their existence was never a huge stretch for me. But what really sticks with me is the way that veteran guide spoke of their intelligence and parapsychological abilities. That they can read human emotion as clear as pages in a book. That they know our species better than we know ourselves.
Looks like that's it for tonight, dear listeners. Until next time, I'll be leaving you in the dark where whispers linger and shadows dance. Stay wary, sleep well, and beware the whispers in the night. If you have a story to tell, please reach out via email at contact@campfirecultpod.com or leave me a voicemail message at 720-297-8608. You can follow us anywhere on social media at campfirecultpod and online at campfirecultpod.com. And finally, if you don't mind, please rate and review wherever possible.